Okay, so we're going to start looking at probabilities, and probabilities is looking at the chances of events happening. So we've got some events here labelled from A to E, and we're going to put those probabilities on what we call a probability scale. So we've got probability scale running from impossible up to certain. So we've got a tossed coin will land on its side. Well, it's not impossible, but it's probably pretty unlikely that a tossed coin is going to land on its side. So I might put that sort of position there on my probability scale. Next one, the next car I see will be silver. Well, that's obviously not impossible, it's not certain, but it's certainly more likely than the tossed coin landing on its side. So I might put that in about that position there. Then rolling a 7 on a 6-sided dice. Well, a 6-sided dice is only labelled from 1 to 6. So rolling a 7 is going to be impossible. So we'll put that there on our probability scale. Today will end at midnight. Well, that's going to be a certain event, so we'd put that here. And then giving birth to a boy, we'd probably say that's about even. So I'm going to put that on the scale about there. Okay, so when we look at probabilities, we will have to quite often work out the probability of something happening. So some key points here. An outcome is an end result. For example, one outcome of flipping a coin is a head. There are 2 outcomes you can get if you flip a coin. There will be a head and a tails. There are 2 outcomes for that. All probabilities have a value between 0 and 1. So you can never have any probability higher than 1 or lower than 0. To represent something as a probability, you can use a fraction, you can use a decimal, and you can use a percentage to describe probabilities. So we'd say the probability of a head, and we normally write that like this in shorthand. So the probability of a head is there's 1 outcome that's a head out of 2 possible outcomes if we flip a coin. So we'd say the probability of a head is half, so that's the value between 0 and 1. Or we could say it's 0.5, we could give it as a decimal, or we could give it as a percentage. So any of those will be reasonable answers. Say the probability of flipping a head, this is on a fair coin, and we'll talk about what it means by a fair coin in a moment. But the probability of a head would be 0.5, a half, or 50%. So fair means that the pointer on the spinner is equally likely to stop at any position. So if I look back at this one, where I said a fair coin, if it's fair, it's just as likely to land on a head as it is a tail. So on this spinner, it's equally likely to stop at any position. So what we could think here is outcomes, possible outcomes for the numbers. We could get possible outcomes of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8. So possible outcomes for our spinner on here are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or 8. Or we could look at the colours, and we could look at possible outcomes for the colours would be yellow, red, or blue. So if we want to work out the probability of something happening, so if, say we want to work out the probability of getting an 8. So we'd write that down like that. And if we look at, there's only 1 outcome, which gives us an 8. So we've got 1 outcome out of a total of 8 possible outcomes looking at the numbers. So only 1 of those outcomes is an 8. 1 outcome out of 8 gives us a probability of an 8. If we said what's the probability of an even number, so we'd write that like that. And if we look at all the even numbers, so we've got 8, we could have the 2, we could have 6, or we could have 4. So any of those would give us even numbers. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 even numbers out of 8 possible outcomes if we spin the spinner. So 4 8s, which would be equivalent to, if we divided numerator and denominator by 4, would be equal to a half, or 0.5. So that's the probability of an even number. We could look at colours, and we could say what's the probability of spinning the spinner and getting a yellow. So if we look, we have 2 sections which are yellow, so 2 out of 8 possible sections, so 2/8, or an equivalent fraction 1/4. So the probability of an event happening is the number of outcomes there are. So if we look back to here, there are 8 possible outcomes if we spin the spinner, but the number of successful outcomes that gave us a yellow, there were 2 successful outcomes that gave us a yellow. So it only works, this formula, if the outcomes are equally likely. So it needs to be a fair spinner. You're just as likely to get a 7 as you are a 3, as you are a 4, etc. So I'm going to give you a question now to have a look at. What would be the probability of getting a square number on this spinner? So have a think what you think the probability of getting a square number on this spinner is. Give your answer as a decimal, and you'll need to enter that in a moment onto your screen.